She thought she'd left him in the past. But fate wasn't finished with their story. What would you do if the first boy who ever held your heart reappeared on the day he was about to marry someone else? Ellie Harper spent years learning how to forget. Forget the boy who promised he'd write. Forget the summer she gave him her trust. Forget the silence that followed. But when she looked up that autumn afternoon in Vermont, there he was, Daniel Morgan. No longer the young man from Silver Hill, but a millionaire groom in a tailored suit. And someone else's ring. Now, Ellie faces a quiet war inside her. Does she stay silent and let him go again, or does she risk everything to speak a truth that could ruin it all? This is a story about love found in forgotten places, about wounds that never fully closed, and about the courage it takes to choose the heart when it might be too late. If you've ever carried the memory of a love you thought you lost, tell us in the comments. Your story matters. Now, let's begin with a woman who thought she was just working another wedding. Until she saw him. She thought she'd buried the past. But when she looked up, there he was about to marry someone else. The wind that morning carried the faint scent of cinnamon and dried leaves, weaving its way through the wooden beams of the old barn at Maplewood Farm. It was early autumn in Vermont, and the trees had begun their quiet transformation, fiery reds, buttery yellows, deep amber. The kind of season Ellie Harper had always loved, beautiful, but fleeting, like most things in her life. She stood by the long dining table near the barn's open archway, her fingers brushing linen napkins into place with quiet precision. The setup was nearly done. Rows of rustic wooden chairs lined with eucalyptus garlands, crystal glasses catching slants of golden light. It would be a stunning wedding, no doubt, the kind that belonged on magazine covers. The kind she would never be invited to, except to work behind the scenes. Her brown boots, scuffed and speckled with dust, moved carefully across the hardwood floors. In her khaki vest and long-sleeve shirt rolled at the cuffs, Ellie looked nothing like the girl she once was. She had grown into her quietness over the years, learned how to disappear without being gone. Blending into the rhythm of polished silverware and floral symmetry had become second nature. And then the air shifted. It wasn't the breeze that changed, but something heavier, as if the silence itself took a breath. Ellie looked up. Her eyes met his before her mind had time to stop her. He stood at the far entrance, flanked by two groomsmen and a wedding coordinator, his figure backlit by the warm October sun pouring in through the open barn doors. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly cut navy suit, his tie the color of crushed burgundy roses. But it wasn't the suit that made her chest tighten. It was the face. Daniel Morgan. The name echoed in her ribs like the final note of a song she'd forgotten how to hum. Her breath caught. She gripped the edge of the table as 1,000 memories surged like a wave hitting a dam threatening to burst through. Her knees weakened, but her training kicked in. Head down. Keep moving. Don't be noticed. Don't let him see you. She turned away, heart pounding so loud she was sure someone would hear. But the noise of arriving guests, the rustling of florists adjusting centerpieces, and the soft test notes of the string quartet disguised her panic. He wasn't supposed to be here. Of course he could be here, she reasoned. Vermont was a popular destination for upscale weddings. But this wedding. At this venue, with her working in the background, fate had a cruel sense of humor. She reached for a set of wine glasses, hands trembling slightly as she arranged them on the sweetheart table. Her reflection in the glass, faint and distorted, looked tired. She hadn't worn makeup that day. No one expected her to. From the corner of her eye, she felt him noticing her. A shift in his stance, a pause in conversation, then footsteps, slow, hesitant. Ellie, The sound of her name, spoken like a question, like a whisper through time, broke something open inside her. She froze, her fingers stilled on the last glass stem. She hadn't heard that voice in almost 20 years. But somehow, it still found the old places in her heart, the corners she'd boarded up, swept clean, and tried so hard to forget. She didn't turn around, couldn't. Instead, she gathered the last of the table settings, forcing her limbs into motion. If she looked at him, really looked, everything might come rushing back. The summer evenings, the laughter, the way he used to tuck a pencil behind his ear while reading poetry to the kids at the community center. The kiss that never happened, but lingered anyway. She stepped away quickly, weaving between the floral stands and serving carts, her breath short. Someone called her name, a co-worker, but it barely registered. Outside the barn, the wind was cooler, sharper. She hurried toward the side of the property where the old glass greenhouse stood, no longer used for actual plants, but kept intact as a charming relic of the farm's past. Ivy curled around its beams, and the panes trembled softly in the breeze. Ellie ducked inside, leaning against the glass wall, her palms flat against the cool surface. Her chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm. The scent of old soil and sun-warmed wood filled her lungs. She had imagined many versions of Daniel Morgan over the years, the boy he was, the man he might have become. But not this, not the man who had just spoken her name like it still meant something, and not the groom standing at the altar of a life that had no place for her in it. She squeezed her eyes shut. What were the odds? What cruel strand of fate had pulled their timelines together at this precise moment, with her in work boots and an apron, and him about to marry someone else as she sank onto the edge of an old wooden bench? Her thoughts raced, spiraling through the decades, through memories she thought she'd packed away for good. Outside, through the glass, she saw the edge of his suit pass by. Ellie pulled her coat tighter and whispered to herself, barely audible, "Why here, why now? Love begins in small towns, with dusty roads and borrowed books." The summer Ellie turned 16 was the kind of summer that left stains on memory's sun-warmed wood, rain on tin roofs, the hush of fireflies just before dusk. In the small town of Silver Hill, New Hampshire, life moved slowly, like a creek that had forgotten how to rush. Her days began with the smell of toast and her father's quiet coughing from the back bedroom. He used to be a mechanic before his body betrayed him, lungs worn out, hands trembling too much to hold a wrench. Her mother had passed when Ellie was 12, and since then, the world had narrowed to 2 rooms, 1 small garden, and a steady list of responsibilities. That summer, a group of college students arrived to run an enrichment program for local kids at the community center. Silver Hill didn't have much, just a library the size of a gas station, a diner that served only 2 kinds of pie, and a church that doubled as a food pantry, but it had children, and the town hoped this program might give them something more than dusty roads and dreams. Ellie wasn't part of the program, technically. She was too old for the workshops and too young to be an assistant, but she came anyway, helping set up tables, organizing art supplies, sweeping floors. It was better than staying home all day. That's where she met him, Daniel Morgan. He was 25, tall and lean, with dark hair that flopped over one eyebrow when he read. A senior at Harvard, though he never said it out loud unless someone asked. Most days he wore button-down shirts with the sleeves rolled up, and carried a worn leather satchel filled with books that didn't belong in Silver Hill. Steinbeck, Baldwin, Rilke. He had a quiet way of listening, like what you were saying mattered, even if you didn't think it did. And when he laughed, it wasn't loud, but full-bodied, like it started in his chest and worked its way up. At first, they didn't talk much. Ellie would nod when he passed, maybe offer a stack of paper or restock markers near his station. But one day, during a thunderstorm that canceled the outdoor activities, she found herself stuck at the center, past closing. Daniel was the only one left, sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading aloud to no one in particular, his voice low, measured, the kind of voice made for late-night radio or bedtime stories. She stood in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. "You like poetry?" he asked without looking up. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "I don't know. I've never really had the time." He smiled. "That's a shame. Everyone needs a poem or two that belongs just to them." From that moment, the space between them began to close. They started sharing pockets of the day, folding paper birds with the kids, cleaning up paint spills, sitting on the steps during break, passing back and forth a dog-eared copy of The Little Prince. He lent her books. She brought him black coffee from the diner across the street. They didn't talk about their families or about what came next. They just existed inside those summer weeks as if nothing else needed to be discussed. One afternoon, after the kids had gone home, Daniel found Ellie alone in the art room, her fingers smeared with charcoal. She had been drawing, though she never called it that. Just scribbling. He sat beside her and studied the sketch. It was of a tree. Not perfect, but real. Honest. "You have an eye," he said. Ellie shrugged. "I don't have time for art." "You don't need time," he replied softly. "You need space." She never forgot that. The days passed too quickly after that. The final week of the program approached with a quiet inevitability. People packed. Plans were made. Daniel would return to Cambridge. Ellie would go back to caring for her father, back to her quiet routines. But something in her had shifted. A door opened she hadn't known existed. On the last night, there was a small celebration, lemonade in paper cups, handwritten thank you cards from the kids. Daniel stood by the exit, saying goodbye to parents and volunteers. Ellie waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. She wore her mother's old cardigan, sleeves too long, shoulders a bit loose. In her hands was a sketch one she'd worked on secretly, the old oak tree behind the community center, drawn from memory. She handed it to him, no words, just the drawing. He looked at it, and then at her. Neither said anything for a long time. "I'll write," he said finally, voice low. Ellie nodded. "Okay." But something in his eyes told her the truth, not out of cruelty, but out of life. He didn't know how to carry her into the next chapter, and she didn't know how to ask him to. They didn't hug, didn't kiss. He left that night, walking down Main Street with his satchel and her drawing tucked inside. Ellie watched from the window of the center, her breath fogging the glass. The town was quiet again, and for the first time she realized how loud silence could be. The boy she once loved now wore a tuxedo, a diamond watch, and someone else's ring. The light filtering through the tall barn windows had changed since morning. It was softer now, gentler, less golden, and more amber, like the last hour before a candle goes out. Outside, the Vermont countryside stretched in shades of rust and ochre, leaves dancing slowly to the ground as if reluctant to let go. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet urgency, florists checking boughs, staff adjusting chairs, a violinist rehearsing in the far corner of the barn. Ellie Harper moved through it all like a ghost in her own life, present but not seen. Her clipboard was clutched a little tighter than usual. Her breath was steady but shallow. She told herself it was the pace of the day, the pressure of the event, the need for perfection. But she knew better. He was here. Not just here. He was the groom. Daniel Morgan. It still didn't feel real, even after the moment in the greenhouse. even after hearing him say her name like it still belonged to his mouth. Ellie hadn't spoken to anyone about it. Not Rachel, not Rebecca, not the bride's coordinator. She simply walked back into the barn, head down, hands moving, placing cutlery, adjusting menus, polishing glasses that were already clean, anything to stay in motion, anything to avoid looking at him. But it was impossible to ignore the shift in the room since he arrived. People moved differently around him. Waitstaff spoke in hushed tones when he passed. Vendors lingered longer than necessary, hoping to get a word in. Even the florist, a woman who never looked up from her arrangements, peeked over her roses just to catch a glimpse. Daniel Morgan, someone whispered near the bar. The agri-tech guy. Wright built that vertical farming system out west. Sold it to 3 countries. Silicon Valley legend, another voice added. And he's marrying into the Davenports. That's old money royalty. Ellie didn't respond. She folded a napkin, then another. She had never cared much for wealth, or pedigree, or the kind of success that earned press coverage. But it was strange to hear Daniel's name spoken like a brand, like a company rather than a person. To her, he had always been just Daniel, the man who read poems out loud when he thought no one was listening, the one who taught kids how to fold paper cranes with hands far too large for origami, the man who looked at her sketches like they were treasures. And now, he wore a tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection. His hair, once floppy and boyish, was slicked back in neat, distinguished waves. His beard was trimmed just so, and a diamond watch glittered subtly on his wrist. He looked every inch the powerful, poised businessman. But Ellie knew better than most people often wore success like a shield. At one point, she caught sight of Lila Davenport, his bride-to-be, sweeping into the room in a cloud of ivory silk. Lila was as poised as her press photos suggested, tall, sharp-featured, with a voice that sliced through the air like a bell. She placed her hand lightly on Daniel's arm, smiling for a photographer, and for a brief second, Ellie watched him smile back. But there was a flicker, so fast she almost missed it. A hesitation, a dullness in his gaze, just before the smile arrived. The kind of look that said, "I'm here, but not entirely." She turned away quickly. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was just the sting of memory clouding her vision. She moved toward the head table, fixing place cards, aligning cutlery, anything to stay busy. The barn echoed with the sound of light chatter and string instruments warming up. Someone asked for more candles to be lit. Someone else asked for more napkins at the dessert bar. She fulfilled each request like muscle memory. And then, once again like gravity had pulled her chin upward, her eyes found him. Daniel stood across the room, alone now. Their eyes met. It was only a second, a heartbeat. But in that single moment, time unraveled. Ellie felt herself pulled backward 20 summers ago, sitting on stone steps as his voice drifted over the pages of a borrowed book. She could feel the press of warm air, the scratch of charcoal under her nails, the rush of wanting something she couldn't name. All of it came back. The wanting, the loss, the ache, and Daniel. He didn't look away. He stood still, glass in hand, like a man looking at something he didn't know he'd been searching for. It took every ounce of control Ellie had to break the gaze. She turned sharply, face flushed, heart pounding in her chest. She could not do this, not here, not while wearing an apron and boots and hiding behind napkin folds, not while he wore another woman's ring on his hand. She moved toward the barn doors, ready to step outside just for a minute, just long enough to breathe. But before she could reach them, a voice cut through the room. "Ellie, can I borrow you for a sec?" It was Rebecca, her supervisor. Clipboard in hand, eyes locked on the dessert station. Ellie paused, mouth half open. "We need help with the custom place cards. They got shuffled in the wind, and they're out of order. Chef's losing his mind." Ellie blinked, nodded, and turned back around. The door out her chance to disappear slipped from her grasp like mist through fingers. Success can polish a man, but it can't clean the ache in his eyes. The applause had faded after the rehearsal toast, but Daniel Morgan stood by the back window of the barn, untouched by the noise. In his hand, a half-empty glass of sparkling cider reflected the late afternoon light. But he hadn't taken a sip in over 15 minutes. He wasn't listening to the band's run-through. He wasn't thinking about the timeline of the ceremony. He was thinking about her, Ellie Harper. Of all the faces he expected to see today, high school classmates turned PR managers, venture capitalists in slim-cut suits, Lila's aunt with her habit of collecting luxury handbags, she was the one he never imagined. And yet, there she was, just past the hydrangeas, standing beneath the iron arch near the east wing of the barn. Same quiet strength, same stormy eyes, only now she wore a black apron and sturdy boots, a headset tucked behind her ear, and when he'd said her name, she had looked at him like a ghost had spoken. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. The name had slipped from his mouth like breath on glass, fragile, unintended, but revealing something long hidden. Ellie. He could still hear his own voice, hushed but heavy. She had fled before he could say another word. Now, hours later, the memory sat on his shoulders like a wet coat. Daniel turned from the window and wandered slowly toward the hallway that led to the staff quarters, as if proximity might bring clarity. But all he found was more silence and more ache. He remembered the way she used to sit on the steps of the Silver Hill Library, her hands stained with charcoal, sketching things no one else could see. He remembered the smell of lilacs on her scarf, the way she always tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. He had loved her, not in the noisy, fiery way his later relationships had demanded, but in a quiet, bone-deep kind of way that had stayed with him longer than he realized. When he left Silver Hill for Harvard, he had every intention of writing, and he had, at first, a letter tucked between textbooks, a postcard from Boston, a short note about finals. But then came the startup incubator, the whirlwind of late nights, code sprints, demo days, investors, pitches. His first big failure, life, with its teeth. The letters slowed, then stopped, and shame crept in where longing had once lived. He had always meant to reach out again when he had made it, when he had something worthy to show her. But by the time his first company was acquired, he'd convinced himself that chapter had closed, that she had likely married someone steady, someone local, someone who didn't get swallowed whole by ambition. So to see her now, here, and not as a guest or a vendor, but as staff, it twisted something in his chest. Not because he judged her, but because she'd once been the brightest, most quietly brilliant person he knew, and now she looked like she wanted to disappear inside a clipboard. Daniel Lila's voice floated in from behind him, light as satin but laced with a thread of concern. He turned, blinking back the haze. She smiled, but her eyes searched his. "You okay? You've been quiet since the walkthrough. Is it the seating chart again?" He shook his head gently. "No, nothing like that. Just a lot on my mind." She reached up to smooth the lapel of his jacket, a practiced, almost automatic gesture. "You're probably just tired. It's been a long week, between the investors' dinner, the media preview, and all of Mom's requests, honestly. I don't know how you haven't run off screaming." He offered her a soft smile. "You've done a beautiful job, Lila. Really. She brightened. "I just want everything to be perfect." Then, with a gentle squeeze to his arm, she moved back toward her bridesmaids, chatting about hair and weather. Daniel stood still. Her words echoed in his head. Perfect. This wedding. This life. This version of him, wrapped in success and social expectation. Was this perfect, or just polished? He made his way toward the service hallway. A few members of the planning team bustled around, checking clipboard notes, moving trays, setting up dessert displays. He spotted a woman in navy, one of the coordinators, and approached her. "Hi," he said, casually. "Quick question. Do you happen to know the name of the woman helping with the front of house setup earlier, dark hair? About this tall?" He gestured softly. The coordinator gave a quick smile. "Oh, Ellie. That's Ellie Harper. She's been with Maplewood for over a year now. Not part-time, she's on staff." Daniel blinked. "So she's here often. Almost every wedding," the woman said. "She's one of the best we've got. Always early. Always professional." Professional. The word settled like a stone in his gut. That meant she hadn't just wandered into this place. She hadn't been hired just for the weekend. She belonged here, had built a life here, one he hadn't seen, hadn't imagined, hadn't reached for. How many weddings had she quietly worked while he was off speaking at conferences and signing merger deals? How many times had she blended into the background? How many moments had he missed? He thanked the woman and stepped outside onto the gravel path behind the barn. The wind picked up, rustling the golden leaves above. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere near the orchard, laughter rose from a gathering of guests sipping cider. But Daniel heard none of it. His mind buzzed, not with nerves, but with knowing. This wedding, the guest list, the grandeur, the press was supposed to mark a new chapter, a fresh start, a future. But now, standing in the cool October light, all he could think was, "This wedding may not be the answer I thought it would be." Some hearts stop waiting. Hers never did. The sky had begun its quiet descent into dusk. Light slanted through the tall pines along the edge of Maplewood Farm, painting the gravel paths in soft, rust-colored stripes. It was the hour between bustle and breath, when the day sighed and everything stood still for just a moment. Ellie Harper leaned against the frame of the catering shed, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee she didn't plan to finish. Her black apron was stained with buttercream, and her hair was coming loose from its clip, but she didn't care. Not tonight. Beside her, Rachel leaned back on a stack of folded linens, legs stretched out, sipping from her own mug like it held something far stronger than coffee. "You've been off all day," Rachel said gently, breaking the silence. "And don't tell me it's just the wedding stress. You handle triple-booked weekends without blinking." Ellie gave a soft chuckle, but it faded quickly. Her gaze remained fixed on a patch of golden leaves near the fence line. "I saw someone today," she said finally. "Someone I never thought I'd see again." Rachel looked at her, curiosity sparking. Old flame Ellie nodded. Barely. Rachel didn't push. She waited. "It was Daniel," Ellie said, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. "Daniel Morgan." Rachel sat up straighter. "As in?" The groom Ellie nodded again. The silence between them deepened, more reverent now, as if even the trees paused to listen. They had worked together for years. Ellie and Rachel. They'd mopped floors in storm-black nights, chased raccoons from outdoor weddings, and once improvised a bridal bouquet out of herbs and wildflowers when the florist canceled last minute. Through it all, Rachel had learned how to read Ellie the way others read menus. Quiet glances, half smiles, deep silences, but she had never heard her voice tremble like it did now. "I was 16, Ellie began, eyes still on the trees. and he was 25. He came to Silver Hill one summer to teach at the youth center. He was still in school then, Harvard. I think everyone loved him. But Rachel waited. I adored him, Ellie whispered. In that way, only a quiet, bookish girl with a sick father and too much time on her hands can adore someone who makes her feel seen. She looked down at her hands, thumbs tracing the curve of the ceramic mug. He listened when no one else did. Talked to me like I mattered, like I wasn't just the girl who smelled like hospital rooms and library dust. Rachel said nothing. She just reached over, touched Ellie's knee, let the gesture speak what words couldn't. Ellie's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. He left at the end of summer, said he'd write, and he did. For a while, she gave a small, sad smile. Postcards from Boston, notes on yellow paper, a pressed leaf once, from Harvard Yard. I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed. Her voice softened. Then the letters slowed. And one day, they just stopped. Rachel's face was gentle. Did you ever try to reach out? Ellie shook her head. I didn't know how. We weren't anything official. No promises, no plans. Just, she paused, just memories. She set the mug down, cradling her hands together. I never hated him. She said I wanted to. For a while, I think I told myself I did. But the truth is, I understood. He had a life waiting for him. Ambitions. He wasn't meant to stay in a town like Silver Hill forever. Rachel studied her. But you never forgot. Ellie turned to look at her friend, eyes shining. How could I? She smiled, a little embarrassed. You know that feeling when someone walks into a room and suddenly the world feels a bit clearer. That's what he was. That's what he still is, even after all these years. And believe me, I've tried. Rachel raised a brow. Tried what? To forget? To move on? I dated. There was a carpenter once, sweet man, and a widowed vet who volunteered at the shelter. But she paused again, biting her lip. No one made me feel like I was listening to the world breathe, like I was home. The wind picked up slightly, tugging the ends of Ellie's apron. Somewhere inside the barn, music began drifting softly, rehearsal notes for the first dance. Probably. She closed her eyes, letting the melody settle over her. Then, as if to herself, she said, if I had the chance to speak to him, really speak to him, I don't even know what I'd say. Rachel leaned in. Well, what would you say? Ellie smiled faintly. I'd ask if he ever looked back, if he ever thought about Silver Hill, about me. She sighed, the sound long and quiet. And maybe I'd tell him that I still remember the book he left in my mailbox, that I still keep it, dog-eared. With the wildflowers he pressed inside, Rachel was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, you might get that chance, you know. Ellie turned to her, startled, but Rachel just nodded toward the barn doors. You never know what people carry under all that polish and posture. Sometimes, they're listening too, even when they look like they're miles away. Ellie didn't answer right away. She looked toward the warm lights glowing from the windows, the distant sound of Daniel's voice mingling with polite laughter. She wasn't sure what scared her more, that he might not remember, or that he might remember everything. But as she stood, brushing dust from her apron, something stirred in her chest, not certainty, not yet, but a flicker of something softer. Hope, still fragile, but no longer silent. And as she walked back toward the barn, unaware that Daniel was asking about her at that very moment, she had no idea a secret even deeper than her own was about to rise to the surface. The most beautiful weddings can still hide the ugliest truths. The hallway behind the reception barn was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that clung to the walls like dust in an old attic. Ellie Harper stood there, tray in hand, fingers pressed around the base of two untouched champagne flutes. She had only meant to take a shortcut, but then she heard voices low, hushed, clipped, and what she heard made the blood in her arms go cold.
"He still thinks it's real, doesn't he?" The voice was unmistakably Lila Davenport's, measured, elegant, but sharpened at the edges. A pause. Then a woman's voice answered, older, cooler, like ice behind pearls. "Daniel is intelligent, but not unbreakable. He wants to believe that makes him easy." Ellie stilled behind the archway, holding her breath. The two women were just around the corner, standing outside what looked like a small powder room. "I've played my part," Lila said, the doting fiancé, the soft laugh, the touch on the arm. "Honestly, it's exhausting." Her mother gave a low chuckle. "You've done well. The Morgans are new money, but his company is ripe. Their IP patents alone could fund our expansion into Asia. 6 months of marriage, then we push for joint control. After that," Lila continued, "we wait for the cracks, then therapy, then distance, a clean divorce with the right payout clause." Ellie's lungs felt tight, like she was breathing through cloth. Her grip on the tray wavered. "This isn't about love," Lila said flatly. "It never was." For a moment, everything blurred. The air, the lighting, the hum of distant music from the barn, it all seemed to tilt sideways. Ellie leaned back against the wall, grounding herself. The coolness of the wood panel behind her spine, the slight weight of the tray in her hand, the rhythm of her heartbeat pounding in her ears like a warning bell. It was all too much to process. Daniel didn't know. He was standing at the center of this glittering event, about to sign away his name, his future, maybe even the company he had spent years building, and he didn't know. She closed her eyes, flashes of their shared summer flooding her mind, the boy who had read to children, who carried her sketchbook through town like it was sacred, who looked at her like she was the beginning of something good. That boy was being used. And the man he had become, polished, powerful, but clearly still tender beneath it, was walking into a cage lined with white silk and false promises. Ellie opened her eyes, breathing slowly through her nose. A part of her wanted to drop the tray, run out the back door, and never return. This wasn't her fight. She wasn't his family, wasn't his fiancée. She was just the woman who used to know him, who used to matter once, under the low hum of summer trees. But another part, older, quieter, stronger, spoke up. The part of her that still carried the boy in her heart. The part that knew how soft his eyes got when he listened, and how quiet he became when something hurt too deeply to speak aloud. Daniel deserved to know the truth, even if it shattered everything. The hallway emptied. Footsteps receded. The voices faded behind a closing door. Ellie stepped forward slowly, mechanically, like she was sleepwalking. The tray still rested in her hands. The champagne flutes clinked gently as she turned the corner and looked down the long hallway leading back to the reception barn. Light spilled across the floor from the open doors, golden and warm and utterly unaware of what had just been said in the shadows. She stopped in the middle of the hallway, her breath caught, her feet wouldn't move. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was jealous, or bitter, or just trying to insert herself into a life that no longer had space for her? What if, after all these years, he looked at her and saw only the girl he had outgrown? Her heart pounded, echoing in her ribs like wings fluttering in a jar. But still, she couldn't unhear what she had heard.
couldn't pretend she didn't know, couldn't leave him to walk into a future built on manipulation and strategy. Not love. Ellie turned to place the tray on a side table, careful not to make a sound. Her hands were trembling now, but she steadied them with a deep breath. And then she heard it. A soft footstep behind her. She turned quickly, expecting perhaps another staff member, but it was only her reflection, caught in the edge of a hallway mirror. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. There she was, a woman in a pressed black uniform, hair pinned back, face pale but calm. A woman standing at the intersection of past and present, love and loyalty, silence and truth. And for the first time in a long time, she saw something steady in her own eyes. Courage. She reached for the doorknob leading back to the reception barn. Music drifted through the cracked laughter, clinking glasses, the beginning of speeches. Daniel was in there, smiling, likely, making small talk, oblivious. Ellie pressed a hand to her chest. Her heart was racing, but it was still listening, and it was telling her, you have to tell him. Even if he turns away, even if it breaks him, he deserves the truth. She opened the door. Light poured across her shoes. She stepped through it. Some truths must be said where they began. The air behind the reception barn was cooler than expected, the late summer breeze carrying the scent of lavender and hay. Ellie Harper wrapped her arms around herself as she walked briskly down the stone path. The sounds of the wedding faded behind her champagne flutes, clinking, voices rising in laughter, music humming its polished, well-rehearsed tune. But none of it reached the old greenhouse. It sat quietly at the edge of the property, tucked behind a row of pear trees and weathered fences. Overgrown vines curled around its glass panes, some cracked with age, others fogged by years of moisture and sun. Once, it had been a place where brides posed for photos and grooms fumbled with bouquets. But that was years ago. Now it was mostly forgotten, except by Ellie. She reached for the latch. The door creaked, hesitant, as if uncertain whether it should welcome her back. Inside, the light was soft and fractured, falling through dusty panes and slender ribbons. The smell was familiar soil, roses, memory. And there, standing in the middle of it all, was Daniel. He was facing away, hands in his pockets, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the fabric of his tuxedo. Ellie's heart kicked. He hadn't changed his posture much since boyhood, still quiet, still retreating into stillness when he didn't know what to do with his thoughts. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said without turning. His voice was low, heavy. Ellie stepped closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I wasn't sure I'd have the courage." He turned then. His eyes found hers, instantly those same eyes she remembered from Silver Hill summers. But now there was something else beneath them. Tiredness, worry, a flicker of hope. "What's going on, Ellie?" he asked gently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." She took a breath. "I overheard Lila and her mother." He didn't speak. "They were talking about the wedding," she continued, "about why it's really happening." Daniel stiffened. "Go on." Ellie told him everything, every word, every pause, every cruel intention. She described the way Lila laughed, the way her mother planned, the timeline they'd mapped out like a business deal, 6 months of pretending, a carefully crafted divorce, a company quietly transferred into Davenport hands. When she finished, there was silence, no denial, no outrage, just silence. Daniel looked down, his jaw tightening. He didn't move for a long time. Then, in a voice that barely carried, he asked, "Why are you telling me this?" Ellie hesitated. "Because you deserve to know, because no matter how much time has passed."
She stopped herself, but Daniel didn't seem to need her to finish. He turned to the nearest glass panel, looking out into the fading daylight. "I think I knew," he said. "Somewhere in me. I think I've always known." Ellie stepped closer. "Then why go through with it?" He exhaled slowly. "Because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake. Because everyone expected it. Because I was tired of being alone and thought maybe I didn't need real love anymore." He turned back to her. "But when I saw you..." His words faded, but his gaze held everything he couldn't say. Ellie felt her eyes sting. "I never stopped wondering where you went," Daniel added. "Why you never wrote." She looked at him, wounded. "I did. At first. But the letters came back. And eventually, they stopped." Silence passed between them again. But this time, it wasn't cold. It was a silence of understanding, of time lost, but not forgotten. Daniel took a breath and stepped back. "I need to speak to her." It was just after sunset when he found Lila on the wraparound porch of the guest house. She was sipping wine, looking effortlessly perfect beneath the lanterns. She smiled when she saw him. "Hey, you disappeared," she said lightly. Cold feet, Daniel didn't return the smile. Instead, he sat down across from her and rested his hands on the table. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" "Lila." Her smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean. I think you do." His voice was firmer now, steadier. "Tell me what this wedding is really about." For a moment, Lila tried to hold her ground. She lifted her chin, her features tight with practiced calm. But then something in his gaze, something tired and disappointed, broke through. She exhaled, looked away. "My father's company is struggling," she admitted. "And yours." "Well, it's not. He saw this as a way to keep us both afloat." I agreed because it seemed smart. "Practical." "And love?" he asked quietly. Lila hesitated, then shook her head. "We're fond of each other, Daniel. But you and I both know this was never about love." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if grieving something that had never existed. "Then let's not pretend anymore." Lila nodded slowly. "Do you want to call it off?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "I think we both know we have to." Later that evening, Ellie stood by the barn doors, adjusting a place card, when she felt someone step behind her. She turned. Daniel stood there, jacket draped over one arm, his bow tie undone, his expression unreadable. "It's over," he said softly. Ellie didn't reply. She just watched his face, the way his shoulders relaxed, the way something light had returned to his eyes, something that had been missing for a long time. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "but I know it can't be built on a lie." She nodded, her throat tight. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "There's something I want to show you. Sometimes, walking away is the bravest thing you can do for both of you." The announcement came quietly, not with microphones or toasts, not even in the grand dining hall where the wedding reception was to be held. Just a small gathering immediate family, the event coordinator, and a few stunned staff members who'd overheard too much. Daniel stood tall, though his tuxedo was slightly rumpled, and his tie hung loose around his neck. The calm in his voice wasn't performative, it was steady, practiced, necessary. "There won't be a ceremony tomorrow," he said simply. Gasps echoed from Lila's side of the room. Her mother's face paled with disbelief. Her father clenched his jaw but said nothing too proud, too calculating. "We both agree this is the right decision," Daniel added, glancing at Lila, who nodded quietly beside him. Ellie watched from the hallway, half hidden behind a wooden pillar. She wasn't meant to be there. She wasn't supposed to witness a wedding unravel.
But then again, she hadn't meant to become part of it either. Lila surprised everyone. There were no tears, no hysterics. Just the cool dignity of someone raised in a house where appearances mattered, and the wisdom, however late, to know when to let go. "I'd rather be briefly humiliated than permanently unhappy," she said calmly, adjusting the hem of her designer dress. "We're not what each other needs." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and shook her hand. It was polite, sad, honest, and then it began. By midday, the whispers had started. By evening, the headlines: tech tycoon cancels, wedding to heiress bride. What went wrong? Daniel Morgan and Lila Davenport. Split before I do. Phones buzzed. Paparazzi waited just beyond the maple-lined drive. Guests whispered and speculated, champagne still in hand, filling the silence with their own versions of the truth. Daniel handled it all with a kind of weary grace. He issued a short statement to the press, thanked guests, asked for privacy, and said what needed saying without opening too many wounds. But the storm was coming, and he knew it. What he didn't know, what he hadn't even thought to check, was that Ellie Harper was already packing her suitcase. She zipped the old canvas bag with trembling fingers. The room she'd been staying in, a modest staff quarters near the back of the property, was already bare again. Just a cot, a nightstand, and the echo of things she hadn't dared to believe. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since the greenhouse, hadn't tried to. She didn't want to be the reason his life came undone, even if she hadn't been the cause. She wasn't a homewrecker. She wasn't a fairy tale ending. She was just Ellie. And she had work tomorrow. Somewhere else. Some other wedding. Some other couple that might or might not make it. She hoisted the bag over her shoulder and took one last look around the room. It smelled like lavender detergent and lemon furniture polish. Clean. Like she always kept things. Like she'd tried to keep her heart. The rain started just as she stepped onto the porch. Not a drizzle, a steady, soaking rain, cold and full of intention. The kind that made you wonder if the sky was sad for you or just had its own grief to carry. Ellie didn't run for cover. She walked straight into it, each step heavy but necessary. The gravel crunched underfoot, the wind catching the hem of her coat as she passed the guest house, the back gardens, the tent that had once promised joy. Her hair clung to her cheeks, her shoes darkened with every puddle. Still, she didn't stop. She didn't want a goodbye, not when it might make her stay. But he saw her. From the second-story window of the old farmhouse, Daniel stood behind the curtain, the room dim behind him, the storm reflected in the glass. He didn't call her name, didn't run after her like in the movies, because he knew sometimes the truest love was the one that waited, not the one that begged. He watched her disappear into the tree-lined drive, her figure small against the gray sky, her bag bouncing slightly against her hip. She didn't turn around once. He let the curtain fall from his hand, then whispered, "Not again. I won't let it be again," somewhere down the hill. Ellie reached the edge of the property. She stood for a moment beneath a gnarled oak, raindrops streaking her face, unsure which direction to take. Forward felt lonely. Backward felt impossible, but deep inside, beneath the soaked fabric and aching heart, something small and quiet stirred. Not hope, exactly, but the memory of what it once felt like. She tightened her grip on the bag and stepped into the road. She didn't know it yet, but Daniel had already made a vow, not to anyone else, not even to her, but to the boy he'd once been. The one who had stood in the rain 20 years ago, watching a 16-year-old girl walk away, and let her go. This time, he would find her. No matter how far she ran, healing takes time, but love, real love, always finds its season. 6 months. That's how long it had been since Ellie left Maplewood under the weight of a gray sky and 1,000 unanswered questions. Winter came early in Silver Hill that year, with wind that snapped like old regrets and snow that blanketed even the loudest memories. She didn't decorate for the holidays. She didn't bake. She didn't light the little candle she used to keep by the window. But she healed, not all at once, not like in novels. It came slowly like sunlight through lace curtains, like the first warm cup of coffee after days of cold silence. Silver Hill was good to her, familiar, forgiving. The town hadn't changed much since she was 16. The corner store still carried the same raspberry jam she used to love. The librarian still remembered her name. And the air. It still smelled like pine needles and earth after the rain. Ellie worked part-time at the school again, helping with reading programs. The children liked her. She had a soft voice and patient eyes. One of the girls asked if she'd ever been in love, and she only smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She hadn't answered, because the truth was, she still didn't know how to describe a love that had once bloomed quietly, died without a funeral, and somehow still lingered like a scent on an old scarf. It was a Saturday morning in March when the knock came. She'd just poured hot water over her tea bag when she heard it 3 gentle taps. Not urgent, not demanding, just there, like someone hoping, but not assuming. She opened the door in her sweater and wool socks, and time paused. There, standing on the weathered porch of her childhood home, was Daniel Morgan. No tuxedo, no press, no polished facade. Just a man in a navy coat, damp from the morning drizzle, holding a worn canvas bag. His hair was a little longer than she remembered. His eyes, still that same hazel she used to dream about, looked tired, but soft. Between them, silence, not awkward, not cold, just full. "Hi," he said. She swallowed. "You found me." He nodded. "Took me longer than I'd like to admit." She looked down at the bag in his hand. He followed her gaze, then offered it out. "I thought you might want this back." She opened the flap. Inside was an old Kindle, scuffed at the edges, the kind you couldn't buy anymore. Inside the cover sleeve was a folded paper creased, faded. It was the poem she'd written the summer she was 16, the one she thought had been lost when he left, the one she'd slipped into the side pocket of his backpack that last day. Too shy to give it to him directly. Her throat tightened. "You kept it." He gave a slow breath. "I found it a few months ago. It had slipped between the lining of the bag. I never saw it. Not until after Maplewood. I stayed up all night reading it. Every line. It sounded like your voice. Like the girl I couldn't forget, even when I tried." She looked at him, then really looked. The lines around his mouth, the hint of gray near his temple, the way he stood, not confident like the CEO people saw on magazine covers, but uncertain, open. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to ask, not for forgiveness, but for a beginning. "I don't expect anything." He said, "I don't even know if you've moved on. I couldn't go another year pretending like what we had didn't matter, that I didn't walk away from something real because I was too focused on becoming someone I thought I had to be." The tea on the counter had gone cold. Ellie didn't care. She stepped aside. "Do you want to come in?" He smiled just a little, not triumphant, not relieved, just present. "I'd like that." Later, they sat on the porch, wrapped in mismatched blankets. The rain had stopped, and the first buds of crocus had begun to nudge through the damp soil in her garden. Daniel pointed to the flower beds. "You always said spring was your favorite." She nodded. It makes you believe things can grow again." He glanced sideways at her. "Do you think we can?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward him and gave him something she hadn't in months. A smile, not polite, not forced, but full, as if something inside her had finally caught up to the season. This time, it was just about love. There were no flower walls, no velvet invitations with gold trim, no long guest lists or champagne towers or photographers shouting for the perfect shot. Just an old maple tree in Ellie's backyard, its limbs stretching wide like a blessing from the sky. And two people who had walked through nearly 20 years of silence, longing, regret, and rediscovery, to stand hand in hand in the place where it all began. It was a Sunday morning in late May, and the sun was soft on the grass. The spring wind carried the scent of lilac and old soil, and the garden around them had started to bloom again, just as it had every year, without fail. Ellie wore a simple lace dress, borrowed from her mother's cedar chest. Her hair, loosely pinned, still smelled of lavender and sunshine. There was no veil, no diamonds, just a small bouquet of wildflowers from the hill behind the house. Daniel stood beside her in a white shirt and gray vest, sleeves rolled, no tie. His cuff was crooked. He hadn't shaved too carefully, but his eyes never left her, not once, as if blinking might break the moment. Their small circle of guests, Rachel, Ellie's colleague and closest friend, the old librarian who once gave Ellie extra time on overdue books, Daniel's longtime assistant, and his younger sister, whom Ellie had never met but now hugged her like an old friend, stood in quiet reverence. Lila Davenport had not come. She had sent a note instead, a kind, handwritten card delivered by post a week earlier. "Thank you for teaching me that love isn't a deal, it's a decision. I've moved to Colorado to start my own gallery. No more contracts, just canvases, wishing you both the real thing. L.D. Mrs. Davenport never wrote. She didn't need to. Ellie knew that kind of silence. It no longer hurt. And as for the press, the public, the investors, Daniel had made his decision long ago. He had stepped down from daily operations, chose a quieter role in his company, returned the engagement gifts, ended the merger that had never truly been about him. He let go of what looked impressive from the outside to choose what felt true on the inside. Now, as the minister stood with his worn prayer book, Ellie felt the ground beneath her feet solid, familiar. She squeezed Daniel's hand. "Before we begin," the minister said, glancing at them both, "the couple has chosen to speak their own vows." A hush, a breeze. Daniel turned toward Ellie. His voice, when it came, was steady but not rehearsed, like something he had spoken to himself 100 times, quietly, when no one could hear. "I was 19 when I thought leaving would give me the life you deserved, but I see now, the only life I ever wanted was the one I would have lived beside you. I've built empires. I've stood on stages, but I've never felt home, not until I saw you again. I promise no more waiting, no more unfinished poems, no more missed birthdays. Just one life. Ours." Finally, there were no sniffles in the crowd, only Ellie standing quiet, her eyes bright not from sadness anymore, but from fullness. She took a breath, then spoke, her voice like sunlight through trees. "I was 16 when you said you'd write. I waited. I grew. I lived, but I never stopped listening for your voice in the quiet. And now that you've come back, not as the boy who left, but the man who chose to return, I choose you too. Not for what you were, but for who you are now, and everything we still have time to become." The wind picked up then, like a chorus unseen, and beneath the old maple tree where a summer farewell once left, two hearts suspended in time, Two souls now stood, grounded in presence, wrapped in promises not of grandeur, but of grace. There was no dramatic kiss, no loud applause, only hands held tightly, a smile shared through tears, and the whisper of something true, finally spoken. After the vows, they shared a simple meal with friends, lemon cake from Ellie's oven, roasted chicken Daniel had insisted on helping cook. Music played on an old record player, and Rachel convinced them to dance barefoot in the grass. It was the first dance they never had back then. Ellie laughed a laugh that felt like summer returning. Daniel spun her slowly, his fingers gentle on her back. In that moment, under the open sky, they were not CEO and event planner, not lost love and second chances. They were just two people, finally arriving at the place love had been waiting for them all along. As the guests said goodbye and the sun dipped behind the hills, Daniel and Ellie sat together on the porch, her head on his shoulder. No plans, no fear, just quiet. And the maple tree, blooming behind them like memory made real. Some stories don't need fixing, they just need finishing. And this one, finally, had found its end. But for Ellie and Daniel, it was also the beginning. Sometimes, life doesn't give us second chances right away. Years pass, people change, roads diverge. But love, the real kind, doesn't always vanish. It waits quietly, tucked between the pages of who we once were. Ellie and Daniel's story reminds us that time isn't always the enemy. Yes, we may lose touch. Yes, mistakes happen. But the heart remembers what truly mattered. There's a deep truth here. We often let go too soon of people, of dreams, of ourselves. We convince ourselves it's too late to turn back, too risky to reach out, too foolish to hope again. But sometimes courage comes quietly, with a knock at the door, and a willingness to begin again. This story is not just about romance. It's about forgiveness, about honoring the past while choosing the present, about understanding that love isn't always perfect, but it's worth fighting for. So if there's someone you've never stopped thinking about, or a dream you've buried under real life, maybe it's time to listen to that small voice inside you, because love, true love, might not come often. But when it does, it deserves to be welcomed home. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone who needs a gentle reminder of love's power, and subscribing to our channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Your support helps us continue telling the stories that matter. We're so grateful to have you here. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in second chances.